Thank you for joining us on this special day, and I also want to say hello to those watching us remotely. 20 years tomorrow, America woke up to a nightmare.
We're looking at dramatic pictures of New York's World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan, where a short time ago we are told that a plane crashed into the upper floors of the westernmost tower. You can see a gaping hole. That is on the north side of the building, and you can see residual damage on the west side of that building, and obviously fires are burning right now in the World Trade Center.
Oh, another one just hit. Something else just hit. A very large plane just flew directly over my building, and there's been another collision. Can you see it? I can see it on the shot.
Oh my.
Something else has
You know
just...
what? We just saw a plane circling the building.
It is in the other building.
We just saw a plane circling the building a second ago on the shot right before
I
that.
think there may have been another impact. Can you tell? I just heard another very loud bang, and a very large plane that might have been a DC-9 or a 747 just flew past my window, and I think it may have hit the Trade Center again.
Try and recap what's going on so far this morning, and the news is terrible. Just before 9 o'clock.
At 8:42, actually.
8:42, a plane crashed into the right-hand tower of the World Trade Center, somewhat about 3/4 of the way up. You can see the smoke billowing from that point of the building. And then about 18 or 20 minutes later, a second plane, a large plane, we saw it actually on tape, hit the left-hand tower of the World Trade Center about halfway up. An enormous fireball on several sides of the building. People trying to be evacuated. There's the tape of the second plane hitting right there, even as people were trying to get out of the first building. We have confirmed reports now that there was one plane hijacked, American Airlines Flight 11 from Boston to Los Angeles. And that is apparently one of the planes used in this crash.
May we pause for a brief moment of silence in memory of the 2,996 people who lost their lives in the September 11th attack. Thank you. This afternoon we are gathered to take a behind-the-scenes look at the broadcast coverage of that fateful 9/11 day through the eyes of HPU broadcaster-in-residence Joe Michaels, who directed the Today Show for 23 years, including the day of 9/11. Joining me today is Joe Moronsky, an HPU journalism student who I believe was 4 months old, staying with his babysitter about 90 minutes from New York City on 9/11. Yeah. In case you don't know me, I'm Bobby Hayes. I'm chair of journalism and sports media. And for the next few minutes, we're going to ask Joe some questions about what occurred in that control room on that day and the days following. After that, we will open up the floor for questions from you before we dismiss today. Joe, thank you for being with us today. So, by my count, you directed over 5,000 Today Shows in your career.
Up early in the morning every time.
Absolutely. But how did any of that prepare you for that day?
I don't think you're ever prepared for something like that. I don't. We covered a lot of breaking news stories that, even how serious they were, didn't come close to that morning.
So it's September 11th, 2001. A beautiful day in New York.
Like today.
A beautiful day in New York City. Walk me through going to work and how it all started.
Well, it surprised me this morning because today's weather is exactly the way it was then. It was the end of the summer. It was crystal clear out, little breeze, exactly like today. And on our show, we had a history of doing rock concerts, music concerts outside with big crowds. So that morning, we were kind of celebrating the end of the summer. We had a big band outside, which allowed me at the time to put a helicopter up in the air, which is kind of cool. And I think it was more of a celebratory day than anything else. No big news stories, really. And oddly enough, when things happen like that, you get information from very weird places. And the first time we heard anything about it was through our former executive producer, then president of NBC, who was at a meeting downtown at the downtown Marriott and called us and said he heard a really loud noise. So we had a camera up on top of 30 Rock, and 30 Rock is about, for those of you who don't know New York, 30 Rock's probably about 1.5 miles away from downtown. And we had a camera up there always to just show the city. And we dialed that camera up and looked, and the building was on fire. And I had a chopper up in the air, and the chopper pilot said something hit the building. So we assumed, which you should never do, that it was a small private plane out of control hit the building. And that's kind of where it started. It wasn't a big story yet because we didn't know what happened. This is a perfect example of breaking news stories and how they start and where they end up. And as in journalism, you have to be really careful what you say. So I bet the first half hour, first 20 minutes, we talked about a small plane until the chopper pilot said to me, stop talking about a small plane, the hole in the building's enormous, and it could not have been caused by a small plane. So it built from there for many hours, obviously.
So what was going on inside the control room as this story started unfolding?
Obviously, a regular control room, like a morning show like that, has about 15 producers and graphic people and writers on a back deck of a control room. In the front deck, there are only about 5 of us. And probably within the first 8 or 9 minutes, people started to pour in to help. And at some point, before the second tower was hit, the back deck probably had about 40 people making phone calls, trying to get information. News was very different 20 years ago than it is today. You didn't go on the air with any fact until you knew it was a real fact. And unfortunately, we didn't use the New York Times, CNN. We didn't use another news entity to verify the news. It had to be firsthand knowledge, and we really had a practice of you had to have 3 reliable sources.
Those were the days.
Yeah, seriously. So even though we saw the towers on fire, the one tower on fire, we didn't report anything yet because we didn't know. You know, so it built up, gradually built up as we got information. Our first information was phone calls. On that tape that we just saw, the woman that was on the phone literally lived blocks away from the World Trade Center. She was one of our senior producers. And we got most of our information from her, even though she couldn't see anything. She heard the noises. She's the first one to tell us that there was a second, she saw a second plane moments before it hit. And if you guys go back and look at the tapes, you can actually see the plane coming down the Hudson River and coming around the back of the building. So we were learning just like everybody else. My point of view is not to show anything that can confuse anybody and try to show as much as I can. So during those moments for me, myself and the technical crew are trying to find cameras. We had the camera up on 30 Rock and we had a helicopter in the air. As soon as it happened, the helicopter had to go fly north, too far north to really use them for about 15 minutes until air traffic control allowed him to come down to about 23rd Street, which then allowed us very close shots. So it built from there.
So really it was one of those days where everything was changing. There was no set stone. You know, we go into broadcast and we expect a script. Yeah. We know what's going to happen. You were quite literally the only director who had no plan whatsoever.
Right. But that's what breaking news is. That's what breaking news is. And unfortunately, like I said a minute ago, we were following much different rules back then than we have now in journalism. But breaking news is just that. You want to give information to people accurately and it takes time to do that. So over those first 20 minutes or so, the news was coming in really sparsely. We were only hearing a couple of phone calls from people, and we really didn't have a good grasp on the story. I will say what you just said, Joe, is kind of interesting. To do a morning show, you have a crew of about 50 people, and you've got to keep them awake. So we joke around a lot. We would always joke and have fun with the show. And it gave the show a really good look. When something like that happens, and again, we just thought it was a small plane. When something like that happens, everybody just focuses. The entire mood changes, and it becomes much more serious, obviously, even if it's a smaller story. This grew to the point that almost nobody talked for a while. It was that serious, obviously.
And I know you told me the other day, this was one of those things where planes had hit buildings in New York before.
Yeah, we've had a helicopter hit the old Pan Am building once while we were on the air, things like that. And so, unfortunately, you don't treat it as that big a story right away. I will say to you that I don't think we thought it was serious until the second building was hit. And I watched the first hour of the show and a little bit of CBS, ABC, and CNN last night. And oddly enough, nobody uses the word terrorism. I don't think it was in our vocabulary that strong back then. It wasn't until much later that somebody called the people on the planes terrorists. So we didn't know. We didn't know. It was a different world.
Yeah, it wasn't around until about 9:50.
Yeah.
That NBC shifted the language from an accident to an intentional
An
attack,
intentional,
and it
right.
still
It
wasn't
still
the
didn't
word
hear the word
terrorism.
terrorism. Mm.
But I mean, obviously, in the control room, you have everybody's trying to do things, but in the back, like we were talking about, it's a whirlwind. Trying to get information. Yeah. Did anybody have fear, though? I mean, you don't know what's going on.
I have to tell you, if you're in a control room or a newsroom when a big story happens, people get down to business. I think we were afraid, but I don't think anybody thought about it. You know what I mean? It was one of those situations where you just have to get it done. And in my position, I treated myself over all the years of directing as a viewer. I looked at what we had, and I tried to show as much as I can that the viewer would want to see, to a point.
Mike Tyson once said that everyone has a plan until they get hit in the mouth. So we all got hit in the mouth that day. Looking back, what were some of the best decisions you feel like were made on that day from a broadcasting point of view?
To go back to not giving the wrong information, I think we regretted, obviously, saying it was a small plane, because people might have turned it on and just said, it's not that big a deal, small plane hit the thing by accident. I think the best decisions were to wait for the right information and try not to scare a viewer, but try to develop the story without accurately. I think that's the bottom line, to be as accurate as we could. And I think we did a good job of it as it went along on the day.
And it was one of those things where everything was changing constantly, nobody knew. And as you started to learn more, it's been said that Matt Lauer even passed a note to a producer that said, "Tell my wife I love her."
Yeah. It got that serious. I mean, I think I might have told you a story about one of our producers. Producers in news are a rare breed. They really are focused. That's why they go overseas into war zones and on-camera journalists. We had a producer who was a wonderful woman who was actually in charge of all the remotes that the Today Show did. She came up with all the concepts like Matt Lauer around the world, all those kind of crazy concepts. So she lived up on the west side and saw it on the show. She put the show on in the morning. And within probably about a half hour, she's standing right behind me, between me and the back deck, and she's passing information into me. And she's really doing an incredible job. Very focused. And I happened to take a beat, and I looked up at her and I said, "Mary Alice, how's your brother-in-law?" Because I knew he worked up at the financial company up in the top of the building. And she looked at me and just blanked out and went, "Oh my God." She hadn't thought about it. And she went out of the control room, came back in, and she was in tears. He was already gone. This interesting story about her was that as she walked across town to do that, she saw one of the first building go down. She was walking down, she saw down the avenue, the building there, and when she got to the next avenue, the building was gone. And she told us that, but she had never thought about her brother-in-law. She was just thinking about coming to work and helping out. And that's the focus of a producer. It's a rare breed.
So we focused on the early moments of the attacks, but tell the audience how long the Today Show was on the air continuously.
Well, NBC was not off the air for about 3 days. It was full coverage. I was probably there till about 5 or 6 in the afternoon when nightly news took over. So our crew, most of the crew, the technical crew, comes in at midnight. So we were on all the way through probably late afternoon, and watched it develop. I might have told you the story. One of the weirdest things, because obviously we didn't know what was going on. One of the weirdest things was I had a little monitor. The monitor wall is about 35 feet of inputs from everywhere, and a little monitor down on the right said Pentagon. And Jim Mick, who was our Pentagon reporter, is in a tiny little room with one little camera and a desk. And I happened to glance over at the monitor, and I saw him going like this. So I hit the button, I said, "What's up?" And he's shouting, "Come to me." And what had happened is that plane hit the Pentagon, all the doors got locked, so he's locked in this room, and all he wanted to report that there was a large noise. He heard a gigantic crash. And so that's what the day was like as it went on. We're getting more and more information, and it just built and built, obviously, until we realized this was an incredibly large story.
So 5, 6 o'clock hits, you finally get to leave.
Yeah.
I know we have talked about what it was like to leave, but for the audience, what was that like?
So the control room for the Today Show and NBC Nightly News is in the basement of the building underneath where the studio is on ground level. So when my crew and I left, we had police escorts, and we went up to the street, and to a person, we all looked up in the air. It was the weirdest thing. We all were looking to see if there were going to be more planes or something. It's so strange. That was our first reaction. And we walked across the street to 30 Rock and had a meeting. The building had already been evacuated. And I remember my AD holding my arm. She was very scared when we went outside. It was scary to go outside in New York City. Those of you who've been in New York, it was dead. There wasn't a soul there. The streets were empty, no cars. After our meetings, we all went to a hotel up on Central Park South and walked straight up 6th Avenue with no traffic. Absolutely nobody there. And I was lucky enough to get a hotel room that looked up at the park, which I would always have enjoyed, but I couldn't sleep. And I looked out the window. I sat on the windowsill most of the night and watched fighter jets fly over the city, really low, really loud, patrolling the skies. So at that point, nobody knew if there was going to be any more. So everybody was hiding, really. Fighter jets all over the city, while the entire fire department, police department from 50 miles away were downtown trying to recover what they could.
How did all of this affect you personally?
Well,
And how long did it take for that to kick in?
Last week, I might have told you this. Last week, when I heard on the news that it was the 20th anniversary, I couldn't believe it because I could picture it yesterday. But I don't know if those of you who have been in classes, camera classes or multi-camera classes, the director could show what they want on close-ups. The camera can go way in or way wide and show what they want you to see. That was the first day that I kind of remember where I saw lots of things that I wouldn't put on the air. And one of them that stuck out the other day when I heard it was the 20th anniversary, the chopper that was up in the air had a 100-to-1 lens, which means I could probably take a close-up of one of the top of these buildings really tight. And the camera operator in the chopper showed me 2 people on the ledge holding hands, and I watched them jump. And all I could think of is, how hot would it have to be on that floor? How much heat and pressure that you would jump? And I still see that image. I saw that image last week, and it's never gone away. And I still feel, you feel that, you don't, that feeling doesn't go away. I know that we didn't show anything on the air that would upset people that much. And I know those shots are still in my head, but I don't think we've never shown any of that. And I would imagine, I don't know for a fact, but I would imagine NBC News has destroyed those shots.
And you even told me you radioed into the helicopter pilot and said, stop.
Yeah, well, you know what, enough is enough. I couldn't do this anymore by looking at that. And, even CNBC had a camera over in Weehawken, New Jersey that used to shoot downtown, just for cover shots. And that camera, we got control of it. We had it zoom in a little bit to just show the towers. And that's the first time I saw the building go down, the first building go down. And Tom Brokaw was on our set at that point, and I actually hit the button into Tom's ear, and I won't tell you what I said, but I said, the building's going down. I used a couple other words. And nobody could believe it. And I was a little worried about showing that on the air. And if you go back and look at the tape, it was a close-up of the building going down. And I think that was as dramatic as the second building being hit. Hard to believe. It was almost like out of a movie, but it was happening. And you had to keep strong and try to cover what it is. That's what it's all about.
So, in the end, what do you think, if anything, you learned about being a director in the aftermath of all of this?
I have no idea. I'll tell you what was really good. I think it was about 11, 12 years after I first started directing the show. And I had directed sports before that and some game shows and things like that. I think, first of all, I think you learn something from every show you ever do. I don't know that I learned as much as I was so proud that we did what we did, the way we did it. And I might have learned some things about, properly how to put things on the air, because it was frantic at the beginning. But I think what I learned at that point was that basically we can handle anything and show it the proper way. And I think I was really proud of the crew and proud, as soon as the first tower was hit, NBC News scrambled trucks into New York City from Long Island City where they're stored, and crews were all over the city. And it's just really great to see how a news division can handle a story that's as enormous as that.
And that's something I think, a lot of times we don't realize. We had these brave, heroic first responders running towards the scene to help out. But we also had these journalists running right behind them.
There's an interesting story. I don't know if any of you guys know Ron Insana. He's a CNBC reporter, financial reporter. He was there, and he walked from the World Trade Center to the studio to go on the air and tell everybody what he saw. And he was completely covered in an inch of soot. And he walked in the control room and said, "Put me on." And we all looked at him and went, "Oh my God, how did you get here?" I mean, he walked from downtown with soot completely covered. And that's a journalist. That's a journalist who says, "You know what? I'm out of here. I'm going up there and I'm getting on the air and talking about it." And there were many of those on all the networks.
What did you learn about some of your other colleagues during that period of time?
Like I said before, I've seen it before, and probably, geez, you guys are way too young to know this, but years ago there was a plane crash in Chicago where a plane took off, turned over into a neighborhood, and that's the first time I saw everybody focus in the control room where we're really casual. Columbine was another big one where we were joking around in the control room, and all of a sudden, like this. I think to a person in the control room, everybody did their job. It was so great to see that everybody takes that really seriously. And I don't want to keep dissing today's journalism, but it was really professional. There was no hesitation to do things the right way. And I think that's why I say I go back and look at it and how proud I am of everybody that did that coverage.
And it really is a day that nobody will ever forget. One of my favorite things that we talked about the other day is July 4th, 2009. The Statue of Liberty crown had been closed, ever since the September 11th attacks, with the exception of 100 days.
Right.
July 4th, 2009, you did an open with the same helicopter pilot and the same anchors.
It's totally one of my favorite days. One of my favorite shows. They were going to reopen the Statue of Liberty that day, and we had arranged with the State Department to have the windows taken out of the crown, which took about 3 months, by the way. And we had our 4 talents in the windows, and the same helicopter pilot, same lens, started really tight on them and pulled back and showed the whole statue. And this was the first day that it was going to reopen. And it was just really dramatic. It was a great day. It was a great day. And it was, that open, I just got chills when I saw that, you know, because it was the United States coming back. Those people, some of the kids in my class weren't born yet. Some were born, one of our students was born the day after 9/11. So when they didn't know what it was like before 9/11, 9/11 changed all of our lives forever. It changed the way we do news coverage too. We're much more careful to report things properly for a while until things got a little more out of hand, but it changed the way we did things. The word terrorism wasn't used, and I think it changed everybody's life forever in the United States and around the world.
And for those who weren't alive during this period of time, talk a little bit about the other things that happened in the aftermath of the attack. The anthrax attack.
Well, yeah, we were getting envelope. Everybody, we were really on guard for anything. Even in our control room, right after that happened, they put green, orange, and red lights on the ceiling in case there was any problems. And it happened a couple times. If the red light went on, the doors got locked in the control room, so somebody couldn't get in. And it happened a few times when we thought somebody might have had a bomb outside. I mean, things like that. You were really on guard at that point. The anthrax was envelopes to people around the country, and it really turned out not to be that big a deal, except for the fact that we were on guard for things like that. Terrorism became part of our lives. You know? I don't know. For somebody my age, it was kind of sad to see where we had to go at that point.
But at the same time, it was a huge moment of patriotism and coming together.
My dad was still alive, and he said that it was the first time he saw that kind of a patriotic movement since the end of World War II. He said that's what it felt like to him. It felt like everybody was on the right side. It was really interesting to see that, and it stayed a while. It stayed a long time. Unfortunately, the aftermath of it in New York City and around the country lasted for many months. There was a building on the end of the Henry Hudson Parkway there was a long building right on the water that had big posters of all the missing that the families would put there. And I drove by it every morning and looked at it. And that became reminders to all of us about what happened for a few years, because there were so many missing. And you'd start to see that all around town. And everybody really the patriotism was amazing, actually.
Okay, we want to give the audience an opportunity to ask Joe any questions that you'd like to ask. So if you just raise your hand. Okay, Emma in the back.
Hi, my name's Emma, and first I want to say it's such an honor getting to listen to you and
Oh my
talk
goodness.
about this. My question is, it's 20 years now. Is there any advice you want to go back and give your younger self while you're reporting?
Probably to stay a little cooler, because we were tense, obviously. Like I said, I think that would be the only thing. Maybe to I don't know, maybe to think a little quicker, you know? But when you're doing a big story like that, you have to go with it. And you don't have a chance to look back and say, maybe I shouldn't have done this. The good news, as I said, is we didn't show anything on the air. We didn't really report anything after about the first 20 minutes that wasn't accurate. We really waited, which you won't find nowadays. I'm sorry, I keep dissing it. Up till we were talking about a small plane, but everybody was, because nobody could imagine that a large plane would hit a building like that. So maybe to give yourself a little more time to look back and say, hey, maybe we rushed a little bit at the beginning. That might be the only thing.
Bob, if you've got a question, come on up over here. We've got a microphone that you can ask into so everyone can hear it.
Okay. Who else has a question you would like to ask? Yes, if you'd go to the microphone, please.
Hi, thank you so much for doing this. You talked a lot about what happened on that day, but I wanted to know what was the feeling going into the control room the day after, and when did you, or if you ever, got a sense of normalcy returning to the control room?
The next day was almost exactly the same. As I said, I went to, my whole crew, we went to hotels, and my call time would have been around 3:15, and I think I went back in around 1 in the morning because I couldn't sleep. And it was almost the same feeling as the day before, because things were still developing, number one. I will tell you a funny story, not funny, but I'll tell you a funny story. New York City was closed down. You couldn't drive in or out of the city for probably a week. And on the third day after the show, my wife called me and said, you've got to talk to your kids because your daughter's really afraid she hasn't seen you or heard from you. So I actually drove back up to Connecticut and spent the night at my house. And the next day I came down and I had to have New York City police meet me at the Henry Hudson Bridge to allow me to drive into New York City. And I drove from there down to the studio, and there were no cars. If people were out, they were sitting around. It was the eeriest feeling. That went on for a good week or two. And the control room, probably, the people at NBC, we didn't probably normalize for a few weeks because it was the main story for weeks and weeks and weeks. And it was always part of the beginnings of shows. So not for nothing, it was always kind of, sad when you started on the air for a couple of weeks, because this story didn't go away. It developed forever. It developed until, I think, Ken and I were talking the other day, it developed, I think, for 3 months before they've actually cleared a lot of what was going on downtown. I will tell you that the third day, before I went back home, we went down to the World Trade Center to scout locations to do the show live from there, which I believe we didn't do till the 5th day. And that was the scariest thing I think I've ever seen, to go down there and still see soot in the air, and you couldn't get on the streets. And where are we going to do a show? We're going to do the show from a balcony across the street. The police department wouldn't let us do it. They were worried about other buildings falling, and other buildings had to come down because of that. So this didn't go away for a very, very long time. And there's something that I'm going to tell a little bit about at school. When a big news story happens and you're in a newsroom or you're in a control room, probably a few days later, you start telling jokes about it, because that's how you release the pressure you've had on in a few days. I don't believe there was ever a joke about 9/11. And I will tell you, there were some good jokes about breaking stories over the years. I don't think there was ever a joke. I think that stayed on us for months. It was that kind of story.
Wow. Thank you. Other questions that you have for Joe? Yes, if you'd go to the microphone, please. Thank you.
Hey, Joe.
How you doing?
Just recently, National Geographic put out a really good documentary that interviewed all the people involved in 9/11. So President Bush, Condoleezza Rice, and others were in the control room at the time of the situation. And so one thing was with them is that they didn't know anything at the same time, and they were watching news broadcasts. Did it ever dawn on you that the president was watching your broadcast on Air Force One?
Our show is actually on in the museum, the 9/11 museum, because I think for about the first half hour, I was lucky. We had a chopper in the air. CNN had just put camera on top of their building in up near Central Park. So we were lucky as far as that's concerned. And I always used to say, better be lucky than good. But we were lucky that we had at least a few cameras within the first half hour to really show this. And I think that's why the other networks were. Actually, the BBC aired our show that morning because they didn't have any facilities to do that. So I chalk it up to being lucky, but I have talked with the head of CNN recently about it, and it just turned out that the other networks, we've done that over the years. If a breaking news story is there and CBS is first, we watch that to see what's going on. Like I said, in those days, you would not ever report on something from another network or a newspaper, but you'd see their pictures and try to make sense of what's going on.
Thank you.
Hi.
How you doing?
And thank you for doing this, honestly. But like you've been saying, in the past 20 years, journalism has really changed. And I'm a journalism student myself, so like, would you have any advice for upcoming journalism students?
Yeah.
For something like a breaking news?
Yeah, it's up to you guys. It's totally up to you guys to change the way it is. And I'm not a political person at all. I voted every which way my whole life. But it's up to you guys to get out there and do serious news with serious information. I don't think there are but a handful of reporters now who go out and actually cover stories themselves and research the stories themselves. It's a shame to see a story written in the New York Times and then all 5, 6 networks repeat almost word for word what they read in the New York Times. It's sad. It wasn't the way it was, as Bobby will tell you. We referenced, I referenced before our rules at NBC. If a breaking news story happened, all the halls where the newsrooms were and the studios had speakers in the ceiling. And the assignment editor would say, there was a plane crash in Chicago. We would all know to get prepared. We wouldn't go on the air until we had 3 reliable sources. And by reliable sources, I mean 3 people that had nothing to do with the news that our reporters would talk to and research to make sure it was accurate. And if we can go back to that, news will change again. I don't see it happening, but it's up to you guys to say, hey, I want to report things accurately and the right way. Okay?
Thank you. Any other questions that you have for Joe? Yes, Brianna.
So 20 years ago, I was a college freshman. It's kind of bizarre to still be in college. And I watched your news show as a kid who didn't even know what the World Trade Centers were. So that's the day my life changed in terms of understanding what was going around in the world around me beyond just my friends. I was 5 days out from living at home. What do you recommend to the students sitting here today to become informed citizens so that they can, you're saying the news is not particularly reliable, so what do they do? Because that was reliable in my time. Like I could rely on your broadcast to inform myself to be a better civilian. So how do they inform themselves in the climate that we're in?
Well, the way I do it is I see a story, I see a headline, and if it's on my phone, on Instagram, wherever I see that headline, I then go to the New York Times and read the whole article, because usually the really good facts about how I see that story are way deep in that article. And I could give you a couple examples, I won't go into it, but there were a few stories that happened the last couple of years that I saw on the news, and I went, wow, that's incredible. But the more I read down the column, it made sense to me. And all of a sudden I went, wow, why aren't they reporting that? Because we have a short attention span nowadays. But you've got to research it. The other thing I do personally is I go to the AP and I go to BBC. I go to places that really do their own reporting, and then I can make a judgment on what the story is. The headlines aren't enough, as you guys know. And God forbid you see the headlines on the New York Post. I mean, this is where our news is nowadays. You've got to do your own research, and it's the only way you're going to get really accurate news. It's very funny you say that, because my daughter was really young, and we talked about it. She was here last week, and I said, Natalie, what do you remember about that? And she said, I was in my classroom, and the principal came into, literally didn't say anything, but walked over to people and held their hands and walked them out. And it was kids whose family members were in the World Trade Center. And my daughter said that was the first time I actually wanted to know what the news was. And I think she was maybe in the second grade, I'm not sure, but she was really young. And she said, that's when I really wanted to know what these stories were about. And now she does what I do. She reads around the different places to try to get the accurate story. One little thing sometimes you'll see in an article that really will change the article, the headline itself, but you've got to do that research. And unfortunately, we don't all take the time to do that. But that's what I would do.
Thank you. Read and research. It hasn't gone away. It's still vital to our industry, and it's vital to just being a good citizen in our democracy. So we never need to lose sight of that. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, we have a question from online. How hard was it to keep the bias towards the situation out of the script in the days following the attack, given there's so much speculation?
Nicholas, so I don't think there was a bias. We didn't have a bias back then. You could watch, I won't name names, but you could watch any of our reporters, no matter what side of the aisle they were on, they did the news. I think if there was a bias, and I hope I don't offend anybody that I know, if there was a bias, it was, and I mean this in the nicest way, among the producers. Producers would pitch stories later on, not about 9/11 particularly, but 9/11 was, breaking news was a different type of event. Breaking news was, we just want the facts. There's no bias there. Maybe weeks later, you'd hear some people commentaries about what happened, but when you're on the air with breaking live news, there's no bias whatsoever. You're trying to get the facts out. But I have witnessed many times in a newsroom where a producer would pitch a story and an executive producer would say, no, we're not doing that story. That's where the bias started years ago, with the executive producers who theoretically know their audience and want to feed that audience with what they want to hear. And I think, Bobby, you and I have never talked about this, I think that's where the start of non-accurate news came from, biased news came from. The power above. And I've witnessed it many, many times. We had a thing at NBC News that we didn't think Americans were interested in foreign news, which was a big mistake. So we thought our audience did not care about what was going on overseas. So if you watch, two things. We didn't think the audience cared about foreign news or sports in the morning. So if you watched the Today Show for many years, and I'm going to say 18 years, we didn't do many sports stories unless it was World Series, Super Bowl, and we didn't do foreign news unless it directly affected something immediately in the United States. And I think that was a big mistake.
We have another online question. Joe, how long did it take, how did you make the decision when it was time to return to regular programming? When did that ever happen?
It happened very slowly. I'd say probably over a period of 3 or 4 months. And the entire network was very sensitive to what had happened, obviously. And shows that we had, I know this is going to sound freaky, but shows we had that showed the towers, even in an opening, everything was re-edited. So it took lots of months to come back to a really regular broadcasting. I'd say at least 6 months before you started to see regular shows. But all the shows were basically washed of anything that would be offensive at that time. I'm trying to think of what show. NBC had a show that the open was downtown Manhattan, and they had to re-edit that show. So that took many, many months.
Any other questions? A special thank you goes out to our production crew today and the Chair of Media Production, Rob Powell. We bid you a pleasant afternoon as we vow to never forget the events of 9/11. Thank you.
You should do more.